Hello everyone, and welcome to this businessadvising.org webinar. Today Heather McCarthy will be joining us and talking about improving the margins of your food business. Before we turn the call over to Heather, a few housekeeping items. Everyone is muted for the time being so we don't hear any background noise. But in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen is a little chat window where you can ask any questions, and Heather is nice enough to stick around afterwards for some Q&A. A little bit about us. We are a nonprofit small business accelerator that matches small businesses based on their pain points with volunteer advisors from across the country. Just go on to businessadvising.org and sign up today. We also have a California-based loan program for small businesses that have often been turned down by traditional lenders. A little bit about Heather. Heather currently works as a culinary business consultant, identifying areas for opportunity for young food businesses to improve their internal structures and position for growth. Her experiences in corporate sales and culinary education have created a unique foundation for her consulting business, and Heather is one of our fantastic advisors at businessadvising.org. So without further ado, Heather, I'm going to turn the conversation over to you.
Wonderful. So welcome everyone. I'm very excited to be speaking with you this morning about one of my favorite topics, margin, and in particular improving margin within food businesses. As we go through the presentation, I'm going to do my best to be as clear and succinct as possible while also realizing that on the phone we probably have people who have varying levels of comfort and experience with their financials and financial reporting. So I'll be using some industry terms as well as some financial terms and do my best to explain those as we go along. But as was mentioned earlier, there will be a Q&A at the end, so I do encourage you to hold your questions, and at the end, we will be happy to clarify and respond to any questions that may have come up to topics or vocabulary used during the presentation. So getting right into the meat of the matter, we're going to start off with understanding our COGS. The term COGS is used to describe the cost of goods sold. And what we are referring to when we speak of the cost of goods sold is the expenses that you as a business incur once the product or service that you provide is sold. So this is everything relates to fulfilling that order. It doesn't relate to anything that utilities, rent, other expenses, and a long list of expenses that you have as a business. Those are important expenses, but they don't relate to fulfilling your orders. And today we want to focus exclusively on those expenses that you incur when you have a sale come through. And those are all captured in the category we know as COGS, cost of goods sold. Our objective in meeting today and discussing this topic is to work out ways that you can improve the ratio of your costs to income and increase your net profit by reducing your COGS. So the goal is, if we look at the unit price for your product or your service and understand there's a certain amount of money that it costs for you to provide that product or service to the customer, we want to work on improving the ratio so your costs go down and what you're pocketing or putting towards profit for the business goes up. And in reducing our COGS costs, we can improve profit more than increasing income alone. That last statement I want to clarify for you. What I mean by that is, of course, you can support profit by increasing income, and that is going to serve the business well. But the ways in which you often increase income fall into a couple of options. One is to raise your prices, which is of course an option available to you, but that can often have a negative effect on your client base. The other option is just to increase the amount of sales that you're producing, and then by increasing your sales, your income will likely go up, but there also can be a wear and tear on your operations team to meet the demand. And that can be a struggle over time for the business. So I often like to look instead at the other side of it and look at what we're spending on making our product and how can we improve and streamline and create efficiencies there to reduce the expense so that we're taking more away from each sale to put towards profit. And at the bottom of this slide, you'll notice there's an interesting graphic of a hamster and a wheel. And I have that here to remind us all that my first experience with Specific Community Ventures was as someone at a food business who needed help. So I've been part of small and growing food businesses. I've been a part of startups, and I understand the feeling of being a hamster in a wheel. I think it's a very common feeling for many who are in a small business environment, especially in the food world. And I want you to know that I think that in having this conversation today and in finding more efficient ways for you to provide your service or product to the marketplace, you can start to make inroads towards sustainability and increase profit for your business. And hopefully that over time will help you either slow the wheel or get off the wheel altogether as the hamster and be able to feel as though you're on solid ground as a business owner. So moving into what's going to help us understand our COGS and decide where to make changes is we're going to start with a topic called margin influencers. So looking at COGS, you want to isolate your COGS specifically and determine your gross margin. Now some of you on the call today may already know what your gross margin is, but for those that don't, what we're talking about when we refer to the gross margin is, again, there's a unit price for your product or your service, and then there's the cost for you to produce it. And the gross margin represents the percent that is left over, the percent that you're making off of each sale. So if, in the example here in the upper right, if I have a unit price of $100 and my cost to produce that unit is $48, the gross margin is 52%. So I'm making a little bit more than half off of the money that I'm taking in for the sale after I've produced the item. And the formula to determine that is you're going to look at your total cost of goods sold in dollars divided by your total income for the unit, so what you've sold it for, minus 1. And that percentage is your gross margin. So once you know what your gross margin is for your various products and services, the next step is going to be to look through and actually calculate your margin in your COGS category. What I mean by that is often in your P&L or in your KPI, you have COGS that are broken out into different categories. For example, perhaps labor, food, beverages, other elements that relate to most food businesses, and they're kind of subcategories within your COGS. And each category has a certain percent tied to it. It's eating up a certain percent of your expense in producing your service or in producing the actual item that you sell. So what you want to do is you want to look at each category and go through line by line and decide and calculate what the actual percent is for that margin. So for example, again here on the right, I have a unit price of $100. And if I look at my labor cost, it's $30. So I'm going to look at my COGS category dollars, in this case $30, divided by my income, which in this example is $100, and that's going to give me a COGS category margin of 30%. So what that category margin is telling me is that of the dollars that I'm spending to produce this item for my client or my customer, 30% of my dollars are going towards labor. And as you start to work through the different categories and determine the percent for each one, you're going to start to see where the bulk of your expenses are. And now looking at the bulk of your expenses as a percent is important, but it's also important to look at it from a dollar value. So we want to look, once we have all of our COGS categories margins calculated, we want to look at just not at which ones have the highest percent, but which ones also have the highest amount of dollars tied to them. The categories that have the most dollars and the highest margin are the ones that are going to be considered our high-impact influencers. What I mean by that is the percentage of the margin alone doesn't tell the story. If I have a section within my COGS that has a 50% margin, I'm thinking that's not, that's taking up a lot of my expense, but the dollars tied to that margin are actually only 5%, it's not having that much of an impact. So it's about having a large number of dollars as well as a high percent, and that's going to give me my high-impact influencers. Most commonly in food businesses, the two areas that are deemed the high-impact influencers are the labor and food areas. Those often are the most, the ones that are occupying most of your dollars and expenses when it comes to producing a product or delivering a service to the marketplace. So we're going to then take the information that we have from doing all that pencil work and calculating categories, margins, and start to look at, now we know what our overall margin is for our products and services, and we know what is driving our margin because we've seen which categories have the most influence. So now we want to think about, how do I measure up? How does my business, how does my product, how does my service measure against industry standards or benchmarks? So the first benchmark I want to give is a gross margin benchmark. If you run your gross margin and you find you're at 42% or 47% or even lower than that, you want to take a hard look at your COGS. The reason for that is you always want to have at least a 50% margin. And the reason you always want to have at least a 50% margin is you always want to make sure that in terms of the total dollars that you're collecting, at least half of them are dollars that you're able to put towards your gross profit. And that's really important for you as a business. If you're not at 50% mark, it means that essentially in terms of your cost to your benefit ratio, you're always going to be behind. You're always expending more energy and effort in producing your actual product or service than you are actually taking home or pocketing. So it's really important that you start with just a basic understanding that your gross margin for any product or service should be at least 50%. And then once you know that you're below 50%, there's steps for you to follow if you are in that category to start to decide how to make changes and how to effectively move your margin above 50%. So to start with, you're going to want to calculate how many additional dollars are needed in profit to reach a 50% gross margin. So if you're at 44% and you want to get to 50% at least, or maybe 52%, you're going to want to look at, if I have, again, $100 with my unit price and I want to get to a 52% margin, I can't spend more than $48 to produce my product or service. And again, some of this is going to be a little cerebral until you actually pencil and write down and do the math yourself. It might seem a little abstract, but these bullet points are here to guide you through this process and to be a point of reference for you. So the idea is look at what you want your margin to be, 50% or higher, and look at what you're selling your unit for, what you're selling your product or your service for, and decide and work backwards into then how much you can afford to spend on producing your product. And then you want to model what changes need to be made. You need to look at what, now that you know what you are spending and what you should be spending, you need to find a way to reconcile the difference and bridge the gap. And you can model possible changes. It might be changes to a single area, it might be changes to multiple areas to make up the delta. And for those of you on the call who either already know your gross margin or when you calculate it find you're above 50%, congratulations. That's a great place to be and a good place to start. But I also want to stress that that doesn't mean there isn't room for additional growth, an opportunity for you to advance even further. So what I want to suggest is you're above the 50% category is that you still take the steps outlined above in the below 50% category and work towards increasing your profit further. Anything you can do to reduce your COGS and improve your profit on each unit sold is going to support the long-term financial health of your business. So now that we know exactly what we're doing in terms of benchmarks, it's important for us to go into our options. So we talked about in the last slide with benchmarks that you probably have a sense for some changes, and you maybe even modeled some changes as part of determining your benchmarks and understanding where you currently are and where you need to be with your expenses for your product and service. And what I want you to do is, I can give you a series of options, and I'll give you some real-world examples as we go through, but I think what's going to serve you best is looking to yourself and looking to your team. You and your team know your business inside and out, and you're going to have the best sense for where you can afford to make changes and where changes made to your product or service are going to negatively impact your brand or your product. So it's important that you, alongside those on your team that you trust and are helpful advisors, brainstorm and come up with ideas for where you can make changes and implement changes that are going to positively impact your COGS without having a negative effect on your overall brand or product. So as you start to consider the positive and negative outcomes for each of these options, I've created a series of questions for you to ask and answer for yourself. And it's about adopting this change and all the repercussions of adopting the change that you propose to get your COGS to where you want them to be. So it's important that you look at the positive, negative, and neutral impact on the customer experience, company personnel, as well as morale and vendors. These are all critical areas of your business, and making changes to your COGS is going to affect, in many cases, all of these areas, and it's just a question of whether or not that effect on them is positive, negative, or neutral. And then once you have gone through and considered all of your options and answered these questions, you'll want to start to create a plan. You'll have done a cost-benefit analysis, and you'll have a list of your best options for change. With any change, there's going to be some concern, some resistance, some hesitancy, because change is often met with fear. So one of the things effect that might be considered negative by those on your team or outside vendors or even your customer base. But if you have a plan in place for those negative outcomes and how to address them, you're going to be ahead of the game, and you're going to be able to more thoroughly convince and quiet any fears that there might be in your team or in your client base. So now we've thought about what changes we want to make, and we have created a plan for that, and we want to actually implement the change. So given the careful consideration that we gave all of our options for change, we want to actually come to the point of implementing change. And we want to start by planning and preparing for all elements of change. I'm going to give you a few examples here. So my experience has been that when you are implementing change, the thoughtful but firm implementation is most critical. There's going to be resistance to change, and I'm going to encourage you to stay the course, because it's really important that the message be clear and consistent from the management team, and that the communication about the change is positive. I encourage you to focus on the positive outcomes that the change is going to have down the line on the business and on the individuals who rely on the business and look to the business to support them and their families. What I mean by that is in an example I want to give you of a time when I was working with a team and we had to adopt change. We had an issue with a bank loan, and we had no choice but to make drastic changes to our COGS in order to meet the covenants of the bank. And as part of that, my team and I had to take a really close look at our COGS and start to view every line item with a critical eye and consider how we could implement change. And it was not going to be change in one category. We realized there was going to have to be change in multiple categories. And we decided it was going to be best to make a series of small changes that were impactful, that would ultimately get us to the sweeping change we needed to see overall in our COGS. And when I mean small, I really do mean minor. I mean, one of the changes we implemented was just reducing shift times by 15 minutes. And these were shift times that were normally 6 to 8 hours. So a 15-minute reduction in the shift time of that length is very minor. But it was the cumulative effect of 15 minutes from each shift that ended up adding up to a lot for the business on their labor cost. So that was one change we made. Another change was we made more drastic shift changes. And as part of that, what we did is we didn't expect the individuals who were having their shift hours changed to continue to perform the same duties. Instead, we reallocated responsibilities, partly away from some of our hourly staff towards salaried staff. So it was beneficial for us to look at the staff that were salaried versus hourly and who was capable of handling what responsibilities and where it was most efficient for us as a business to have a salaried staff person handle something versus an hourly staff person.
Thank you, Heather. That was a fantastic presentation, super informative. I think a lot of food businesses in our network will get a lot of value out of those tips and examples. So really appreciate all of that. So now everyone's time for Q&A. I see some people have asked some questions. If you have any, enter them in the chat window, and I'll get started with the ones that have already come in. So this one says, should I make one change at a time, or should I try to implement 2 or 3 of your suggestions at once? What would be the most impactful decision and make the most business sense?
That's a great question. So it's really going to depend on a few factors. One, when you look at your gross margin and you see what the delta is between where you are with your expenses and where you need to be, you might realize that you have such a large gap to bridge that just one change isn't going to be sufficient. So you might need to adopt several changes at once if you're in a situation where you need to make kind of a more dramatic impact on your COGS now. If you don't, and you have kind of the time and can afford to roll out one change at a time, in some ways that could be better because you're able to isolate variables and see how a single change has an effect. Now that being said, it's also going to depend on the bandwidth of your team. it's important that you consider whether or not your team can handle multiple changes at once. If they can, it can be really beneficial. And the example I gave earlier in the business I was working with, where we had to implement sweeping change because of bank covenants and other issues that we needed to address in a very short time, I tackled the shift changes and timing and some of the other elements of the change that related to labor, while I had one of my trusted advisors who was managing our warehouse handle the changes that she made to the food costs, so that we could ensure that we were on target to be where we needed to be within the short time frame we had to work within. So it's really important that you also consider your team and what your team can handle.
Great point. Great point. Someone says, I review my P&L. If I add in key performance indicators, what does that look like in comparison?
Oh, that's a great question. So the two things are complementary. So your P&L is going to give you the data points you need to populate your KPI. And your KPI, to me, I like to look at the KPI as the things, it tells more of a story about your business. And you have to think about what the narrative is that you're interested in seeing about your business over time. And then once you've decided what areas are important to you and what elements of those areas within your business you want to really track, then you use the data points from your P&L on a monthly basis to populate those fields. So this is where you could choose to track, as I mentioned, you're used to tracking like your overall expenses, but this will give you a chance to drill into and just look at things like your ingredient costs and your labor costs, your beverage costs on a more granular level and kind of get a more detailed story of where your business is really at.
Oh, I see. That's fascinating. And there's one that says, and so I want to make some of these changes. How do I communicate it to my staff without causing fear?
That's a good question. There's no single answer to that. One, I think it's really important to be sympathetic, to understand their fear and understand their resistance to it, while also reassuring them, because you've created a thoughtful plan and you have considered all outcomes, to really express your desires for them and for the business and how this is going to benefit both sides long term. And then to be patient. It will take some of your team longer than others to come around, but eventually I find that most do come around and do see that the change is for the best.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Heather, for your time. Thank you, everyone, for joining us on this call. BusinessAdvising.org is here to help small businesses across the country with fantastic advisors just like Heather. Everyone, we hope you have a great day and see you on the platform soon. Thank you, Heather.